Welcome to this special edition of Eye for Iran from the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, where world leaders are gathered. And the world is asking one question: are we inching closer to war with Iran? At the top of this year's agenda, Iran's nuclear program and the enforcement of snapback sanctions. Joining us first, Behnam Ben Taleblu of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies to explain what snapback really means for Iran and whether it risks locking the region into confrontation. Then, Israel's Ambassador Danny Danon to the United Nations on whether diplomacy is enough or if Israel sees further military action as inevitable. And then, author Jonathan Harounoff, whose new book, Unveiled, takes a deep dive into the women life freedom movement, Iran's identity, and exploring the gap between what the regime projects and how ordinary Iranians actually live.
The real question for me is not what Uncle Sam doing now, but what will Uncle Sam do post-snapback?
I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran, taking you beyond the headlines. The FDD's Iran Program Director, Behnam Ben Taleblu, joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you for being here, Behnam.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me, Negar.
So as you can see, we're here in New York City. We're both here for the UN General Assembly. And I was there when President Donald Trump delivered his address. I was waiting for that Iran moment. Of course, it started off with some jokes about the teleprompter not working.
The escalator.
The escalator incident, of course. And then, boom, we went to the Iran part. And he literally said that the greatest threat to humanity and society right now is nuclear weapons and Iran being armed with nuclear weapons. What did you make of his speech with regards to Iran? Did you take it as him being forward-facing in terms of combating that threat and actually doing something about it? Or did you take it as him being maybe indifferent, that he was almost being victorious, that he had dealt with that threat and now it's done, capiche?
Well, certainly I think the president was taking a victory lap when it came to Iran policy, as well as several of his other domestic and foreign policies. He was not shy about letting the UN know about how he felt about the UN system, as well as about some of his own successes at home. But on Iran specifically, I think he was short and sweet, and even there was a almost calmness or casualness with which he referenced the targeting of Iran's senior military leadership just a few months ago by the Israelis. So the president...
He said they're dead, they're gone.
Yeah, he wasn't shying away from throwing this in the face of the Islamic Republic of Iran, but his red line is sharper and you could say even shorter than in years past, particularly when you compare to term one, where the Trump administration combined the nuclear issue with the regional and the missile and the terrorism and human rights to make one larger Iran policy. Here, consistent throughout term two and at the UNGA now, he's made sure the world knows that the nuclear threat is the primus inter pares threat, is the number one threat from the Islamic Republic. So in that sense, there is a stylistic difference and a substantive difference in his Iran policy in term one and in term two, and that absolutely came across in the very tailored way he spoke at the UNGA. Take, for example, the word missile, not even mentioned, even after the Islamic Republic of Iran tested twice now space launch vehicles after the 12-day war.
And why do you suppose that he didn't mention that at all? Was that because he wants to appear victorious and that may lead to an indifference in the policy that they're not dealing with it?
Well, my great fear in general is indifference because, yes, the military strike against the Islamic Republic's nuclear facilities were successful in the sense that those facilities aren't around and enrichment, at least known enrichment in known sites, isn't happening today. But more broadly, I think that's just, you could say, an on-ramp into a much larger, victory, rally around the flag effect that the president is looking to kind of have at home. My fear is that the Islamic Republic might actually encourage this sense of victory from the Trump administration, when in reality, the regime is continuing to build back better when it comes to its missile program, when it comes to its terrorism threats, and when it comes to the threats on the home front, for example. The Islamic Republic still is the biggest source of the problems for the Iranian population. And unfortunately, those themes were absent from the president's speech, and I don't think it was political. I think the president genuinely believes that the most urgent threat has been dealt with, and he seems to have been comfortable moving America into some kind of a containment regime, where if Iran is seen as going towards a nuclear weapon again, there will be more military action.
So where are we at right now then?
Where are we at right now means, in my view, there are several non-American drivers of crisis. One in the very short term is with the Europeans, and when it comes to snapback, that is an inflection point. The second, of course, is Israel, which is not just looking at the nuclear program, but is also looking at the missile program and the regime's terrorist threats. The third, of course, is the adventurism and the commentary and perhaps even the mistakes made by Iran's military and clerical leadership. I'm thinking about Ali Khamenei here. And the fourth is what is happening on the street in Iran as the rial continues to lose value, as life continues to get worse and worse for the average Iranian. These are the four push and pull factors of crisis from 2025 into 2026. Europeans and transatlantic pressure, Israeli potential military pressure, mistakes and overreach by the regime, and pressure from the street below in Iran.
And how do you suppose this, as an analyst, that this would impact the E3 then and their decision making here? Because I went up to President Macron and asked him a question. First, he just kind of nodded his head and avoided and said bonjour. The second time I approached him, he just asked me how I was doing and really didn't want to answer anything about Iran. And this morning, I actually went up to the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte. He almost seemed a little bit terrified by any kind of Iran question. The entire media team was like, we're not talking about Iran right now. So it almost seemed like the sense me and kind of the other journalists were talking about this almost like a fear of speaking out.
I don't know if it's a fear, but certainly no one wants to get ahead of the president, who has some very broad strokes on this. The president, as you know, in the U.S. is broadly supportive of this European push to snap back, but the Europeans have been working overtime to try to not even have snapback. In my view, the Europeans have a very low bar that the Islamic Republic is politically and technically not even willing to meet. So Europe is still fighting till even the last second to leave the door open for diplomacy. And they, I think, understand that snapback could be the source of some sort of a crisis. But in my view, it doesn't close the door on diplomacy, because if snapback restores those older, those tougher, those UN Security Council resolutions on Iran from years past, well, if we look at the chronology from 2006 to 2010, you had those resolutions. But then you had the 2013 deal, and then you had the 2015 deal. So this Iranian talking point that just because you're going to go back to those older, tougher, more stringent resolutions means that Europe will close the door on diplomacy, not only doesn't square with the zeitgeist and the European desire for diplomacy against all odds, as you're seeing, and not wanting to get ahead of the Americans, but also is inconsistent with the history of the Iranian nuclear program and efforts to stop it using multilateral diplomacy.
So if the Europeans have a low bar, what about the Americans right now if they feel like it's a closed deal, that they've already dealt with this crisis?
Well, the Americans are still, at least very publicly, encouraging the European snapback effort. You just saw, I think in late August, Secretary of State Marco Rubio lend support to this consistently throughout 2025, even from both sides of the Hill, but mostly Republican. You've had statements in support of snapback for the E3. The real question for me is not is what Uncle Sam doing now, but what will Uncle Sam do post-snapback? Will America fight to make sure that all the boring little bureaucratic bodies and UN rules and EU Council regulations that were tough on Iran then are updated to meet the 2025 threats of today? Will the sanctions list be updated? Will EU Council regulations be updated? Will there be a panel of experts? So Europe has moved in the right direction on Iran. The question is, when Europe goes in that right direction, where will America be? And will we still have that sense of victory, or will it begin to look like indifference?
What about President of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian's speech? I mean, he seemed visibly angry. I literally had to take out my earpiece. I often, from the press gallery, have a hard time hearing what the world leaders are saying without the earpiece. But his tone, again, visibly appearing angry. He didn't talk about any kind of domestic issues in Iran, like water shortages. Yeah, there was no substance. He was really just angry at Israel and the United States. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, no doubt, the president of Iran is a pretty animated individual, and that kind of seems to be him blustering and boistering. That just seems to be kind of par for the course with Pezeshkian. A lot of style, not much substance. The substance came from actually Pezeshkian's boss a day prior, Ali Khamenei, back in Tehran, who really, in my view, did shut the door on diplomacy. Pezeshkian, Araghchi's job here in New York all this week is to try to stall snapback, run the clock against the Trump administration, divide the transatlantic community, get international support for Iran's position, which is the destruction of Israel and the end to the two-state solution. Those are the things that the Islamic Republic diplomatically is trying to do. And certainly Pezeshkian isn't someone with that kind of diplomatic heft, and you see it in the frustration, and you see it in really the verbiage of his speech. But when it comes to substance, I would pay attention to what Ali Khamenei said the other day, because him closing the door on diplomacy, him not budging an inch on enrichment, that's really where the substance is being made. And that's really where our partners in Europe need to listen to, because if the Iranians are the ones shutting the door on diplomacy, well, then we have to be there for the Europeans to help move them in the right direction on pressure.
And let's talk about the news of the day. There's a Reuters report out that the snapback sanctions could actually benefit China.
Well, I'm not so sure that's going to be the case when it comes to the Islamic Republic's economy. The snapback sanctions will restore all the tougher, multilateral, legal sources of pressure that used to exist on Iran from 2006 to 2015. And actually, the U.S. and the EU can actually backstop that with sanctions of their own. Right now, even without that sanctions, the Chinese are taking advantage of the current situation with some pretty high record oil imports. Hopefully, if the Trump administration sees the Europeans moving in the right direction on snapback, they'll pay more attention to this and force a downward trend. But unfortunately, the numbers in 2025 look like a lot of the numbers in 2024, and that's not a win for the Trump administration when it comes to maximum pressure.
So you don't think this would lead to an export then from Iran to China?
Well, I think Iran is still going to be looking to even discount its oil to get the Chinese to buy more oil. You can look at the data already. The preliminary data that has come out for September 2025 does not look good at all. I think almost north of 2 million barrels per day. This might be the highest ever for all of 2025. China could be having this surge happen now, potentially in anticipation of snapback. The real art of the deal for the president is how is he going to be able to use U.S. unilateral sanctions and marry that up with the snapback to actually force Chinese purchasers, Chinese refiners, Chinese banks, Chinese businesses from driving down those numbers. How do you force that downward trend? The president did it before. I think he can do it again.
And also, in terms of the latest news this week, Iran, since the 12-day war, tested a second missile. This time it was a failed one. What is your reaction to that?
Listen, I think the 12-day war really sharpened for the Islamic Republic the importance of ballistic missiles. And yes, Israel had a very well-layered air and missile defense. Certainly, the Israelis went after not just the missiles, but the launch platforms for those missiles. But the Islamic Republic is looking to build back better. So again, in my view, this is not a one and done. This is about handicapping and rolling back the Iranian threat. And that means looking at where they believe they were successful in the 12-day war and then going right after those centers of power. And because the regime believes its missile program bought it time, it is investing a heck of a lot in that missile program to not just, continue to underwrite threats in the region, but because this was a space launch vehicle test, which is basically the regime's way of growing longer range strike platforms, that means they're looking to threaten Europe in the future as well as the U.S. homeland in the future. So that should be setting off alarm bells that twice since the 12-day war, the regime has been testing missiles, and they're both longer range platforms.
Ultimately, what is sanctions and the snapbacks? What will be the ultimate outcome of all of this?
I think President Trump is pretty content and pretty flexible with what the outcome could be. In the very short term, I don't think the U.S. wants to invest significant political capital in managing the Iran threat. I think President Trump, if you look at his verbiage, is kind of done with being involved in the minutiae of Iran policy. But he's had a heck of a lot of wins already, from forcing the regime to the negotiating table, to restoring max pressure, to destroying Iran's nuclear facilities. There's certainly a lot of wins there already. The ends that those wins could feed into, particularly post-snapback, I think the president is very flexible on. I think in the past 2 decades, you've had a lot of American presidents say all options are on the table when it comes to Iran. I think President Trump has lived every single one of those options to the max in the first 6 to 8 months of 2025. And I think he's going to be looking to keep that flexibility for the rest of his second term. So that means we could have a continued crisis. That means you could have a limited deal. That means you could have a final deal. That means you could have regime collapse or even regime change. That means that the president is keeping his options open, and he's content because he's got all the cards and not the regime.
Do you see regime change happening?
I think this is something for the Iranian people to decide. Certainly it's a possibility when you have your regime this weak, this backed into a corner, this much lacking social legitimacy, basically this bankrupt. The definition of revolutionary activity in Iran is now being willing to flush the bathroom from the 4th floor of an apartment complex. This is how incompetent the government of the Islamic Republic really is. And they think that all they have to do is outlast Trump 2.0, just like they outlasted Trump 1.0. Who knows if the societal forces, structural forces, regional forces will allow the regime to do that. But certainly the trend line is not looking good for the regime.
And what impact then is this ultimately having on Iranian people?
Well, I think the Iranian people aren't paying attention to the drama, or you could say the tea parties that go on here at the UNGA when it comes to the high-level meetings. Certainly, I think there's an anticipation that the West, in particular, needs to stand with them in principle and not with practice. Just a few weeks ago, you may remember, is the anniversary of the Mahsa Amini protests and the killing of Mahsa Amini. There hasn't been much from world leaders down here just a few blocks away on Iran human rights, on standing with Iranian protesters, on how to get communications technology to them. There hasn't even been much on the UN fact-finding mission, which was established after the Women Life Freedom protests, designed to shed a light on those human rights abuses. So the Iranian people certainly have issues with their own government, but I think they deserve more in practice, not just in principle, from Western leaders and from the UN system.
You know, as a reporter who's attending the UNGA right now, I haven't heard anything about the Iranian people. I haven't heard anything about the fact that there's been more than, according to the Behnam Foundation, more than 1,000 executions this year alone.
Yeah, that's a real shame because the Islamic Republic is really, and I've seen this right after the 12-day war, using the shadow of conflict to really clean house politically, and they're coming home after having lost the war abroad and cracking skulls. And this is leading to a surge in violence, a surge in execution, a surge in arrests, with really devastating numbers that beat their own already grotesque numbers when it comes to arrests and executions in years past. So again, things are not looking good from the Iranian people when it comes to the relationship between the state and the street, as well as the things that impact the street, like the economy, like the environment, like women's issues. You name it, the Iranian people are feeling it today.
As an Iran analyst and as an Iranian American, as an advocate for the Iranian people, what is your advice to state officials, to world leaders, to diplomats, etc., to prevent American foreign policy from, like you said, warning of this indifference potentially with the Trump administration on Iran?
Well, you know, the first thing I would say is you have to pay attention. And after you pay attention, you have to make sure that you don't miss opportunities. Take, for example, the speech that I said was much more important than Pezeshkian's speech, which was the speech by the Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. In that speech, he actually said the Israelis were looking to get rid of the Islamic Republic. This is actually a significant change.
That admission is very significant.
It's very significant, but it's also a significant change because post-12-day war, the regime tried to foment this fake nationalist rally around the flag effect, which failed, but nonetheless they were trying. But ultimately, the regime were saying that no, this is not about the Islamic Republic, this is about the West, Israel, America being against Iran itself. And then just a few months later, Khamenei let it slip that this is not about Iran, this is not about Iranians, this is about the Islamic Republic. And in many ways, by saying that, he actually opened an opportunity for significant Western public diplomacy to shine a light on the Islamic Republic. Unfortunately, the West hasn't been taking that opportunity. So my piece of advice to them is never miss an opportunity to remind the Iranian people who their real oppressor is. Never miss an opportunity to show the Iranian people that their regime is the one who has been painting them in the corner and not the West.
My last question, are we inching closer towards more confrontation, potentially a second round of war with Israel?
Well, we're certainly on confrontation footing, but that's a choice that the Islamic Republic has brought to us, not particularly because of the West or events going on in the UN.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Behnam Ben Taleblu with the FDD on Eye for Iran. Ambassador Danny Danon joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here, and Shana Tova.
Thank you for having me.
Ambassador, snapback sanctions have been enforced. What are the next steps in terms of Israel's perspective now?
We have made it very clear that we will continue to pay attention to what's happening in Iran. The attack of Israel and the US was very successful, but we know that the regime still continues to plot to acquire a nuclear weapon, and I would advise them to recalculate their position. You know, they saw what's happening here. The snapback actions are being imposed. There will be more pressure from the international community, and I hope that they will learn the lesson.
So are snapbacks alone enough, or does Israel foresee further military strikes in action?
Well, you know, I think we took the military act we planned. I think we'll have to pay attention to what's happening on the ground. It will take Iran years to rebuild those capabilities. If we will feel that they are posing a threat to Israel and to the stability of the region, we will consider our actions. But as of now, I think now is the time for the international community to step in and to apply more pressure.
So what would trigger then, in your sense, like what's the benchmark? What would trigger another round potentially of military actions, like you said?
Well, basically we have to look at the capabilities of Iran in terms of the nuclear reactors, the ballistic missile industry, to see what is happening on the ground. And we proved that we have quite good intelligence on what's happening in Iran.
And could some people say Iran could become similar to Lebanon, where Israel can come in and do military strikes when they see fit? How would you respond to that?
Well, I don't think that is the case. I think the infrastructure that they built in the past was very complicated. So it's not going to happen very fast. But we will monitor what's happening on the ground.
And How do you respond to Iran's offer to dilute its highly enriched uranium in exchange for sanctions relief? What is your response to that?
Well, I think that the international community, they have enough experience and they're very skeptical about what Iran is saying. We need to see verifications, to have inspectors on place. So I'm skeptical about it.
Let's talk about President Trump's speech today. He had a very hard line on Iran. He basically said that Iran, essentially, with a nuclear weapon, is one of the greatest threats in history to humanity. And he took a very hard-line approach. But he also said that he brought about peace between Iran and Israel and said that they do not seek war now. How do you respond to that?
I agree completely with President Trump. I think he has a point, Iran is a threat, and I would advise Iran to recalculate their position. Today, President Trump proved that he's a strong leader and he's taking actions against regimes who are threatening the stability of the entire world. And I think also other countries paid attention to that.
So do you feel that the military strikes set Iran back by how many years? What are you thinking in terms of the intelligence and your knowledge?
I cannot look into the exact dates, but we will keep watching what's happening in Iran. I can tell you that.
Do you feel that Iran and Israel are inching closer to war, or do you feel that this is moving more towards peace? How do you see it?
No, I don't think we're moving toward war. Israel is a peaceful nation. And I think Iran should focus its energy supporting the Iranian people, not to spend billions on the proxies, on Hezbollah, on the Houthis. They should support their own people in Iran. They deserve better than that.
And do you think regime change is coming anytime soon?
Well, that's for the Iranian people to decide. And I hope that they will do the right thing. They deserve better leadership.
Anything else you'd like to add, Ambassador?
No, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time. That's Ambassador Danny Danon on Eye for Iran. Jonathan Harounoff, author of Unveiled, joins us now on Eye for Iran. Thank you so much for being here, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm with you at the UN, so having a good time. Jonathan, I just wanted to start off by asking you about your own personal journey and your own ethnic and cultural background. You are both British, Jewish, and Iranian. Talk to us about that and how that's kind of shaped not only this novel, but who you are and what you do as a human being.
I was born and raised in the United Kingdom to an Israeli mother and to a British father, but my grandparents on both sides from Iran, from the holy city of Mashhad. And growing up, I always heard Hebrew, Farsi, Israeli cuisine, delicious Persian cuisine, surrounded by Israeli and Persian art, amazing Persian tapestries and carpets. And I was always interested in the cultural similarities between these two cultures, and I was always curious about why there was so much tension and enmity between these two countries, because after all, it would be easy to assume that Iran and the state of Israel have been at conflict for a very long time, but the reality is it's only been really in existence for 46 years. And prior to 1979, there was very much a sort of a culture of collaboration, cooperation that really gets ignored about. So one of the motivations behind writing this book was to tap into that untold history and also to sort of explore a bit of as you mentioned, my background that really hasn't been explored that much personally.
Yeah, you come from a very unique vantage point, right? And speaking of that tension, how does it make you feel as someone who is connected to both Iran and to Israel to see two nations essentially at war with each other? Like, that puts you in a kind of a unique, awkward situation. How does it make you feel?
I think it's very unfortunate and very destabilizing to the Middle East, because these are two nations that have the potential to be extremely extraordinary and successful in the Middle East, and instead the Islamic Republic has included as one of its foundational pillars of its ideology the annihilation of the State of Israel, and also the destroying the West and the United States. And it's very distressing. And I think one of the worst things is that there's also a fair amount of misconception in the West of people assuming that most of the 90 million or plus Iranian people are against Israel, are against the United States, are against the West. And that's very much not the case. There's a huge gulf between the Islamic Republic and the people of Iran.
Well, and also I think Iranians are just like everyone else in society, right? There's always a difference between the government of a country and the people of a country. And even if somebody necessarily doesn't agree with the policies of a certain country, et cetera, people find humanity where it is, right?
Absolutely.
And talk to us about Unveiled. What is it about, and what motivated you to on this 3-year endeavor?
So I spent about 3 years interviewing Iranians inside Iran and in the diaspora who participated in some form in the historic Women Life Freedom Uprising that followed the killing of Mahsa Amini. We just marked her 3-year death and the anniversary, and unfortunately behind me, the United Nations, there very little has been said about the people of Iran marking this anniversary, because I think so much of the agenda has been taken over by the demonization and delegitimization of Israel. But the book was 3 years in the making, consists of interviews with people who've really suffered at the hands of the regime, women who've been shot in the eye, male athletes who've been prevented from representing their country, women whose fathers have been executed on spurious accusations of espionage. And it's really a tribute to these brave women and men and young girls who fight and continue to fight for freedom, even though they are very aware of all the perils in their way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you make, especially, being here at the United Nations, and you would think that given that it's supposed to be the center of, universal human rights, that there would be some talk at least about Iran and human rights and the abuses. But it seems like always the focus, at least for me as a reporter when I come in, has been, the nuclear file and foreign policy, and very little in the way of the Iranian people, or what we tend to focus on, and the people of Iran.
And that was why I think this book and a few other great journalists and writers who are covering this topic have been doing, because even if you just look at the mainstream media, you Google Iran or the Islamic Republic of Iran, and all of the results that come out will be about the Islamic Republic's dangerous and expensive nuclear program. It will be about its sprawling foreign proxy network, or its just dangerous foreign policy. Very little, you won't see any Google results about the people of Iran, who they are, what their aspirations are, what their hopes are for a future Iran, how they feel about the Islamic Republic. And you certainly don't see those conversations behind me here. Even at the height of the Women Life Freedom Uprising at the end of 2022, very few measures were taken here. There was one move to remove the Islamic Republic from the Commission on the Status of Women, which they eventually did after extraordinary pressure in December 2022. But beyond that, and apart from the renewed looming snapbacks, you're not seeing much being done for the actual people of Iran.
Yeah, and even going up to world leaders myself, the topic of Iran is very sensitive, and I get a lot of people say, oh, well, we're not talking about that right now, and they seem quite terrified at the thought of when I even bring up the topic of Iran.
Well, I mean, we've seen that the Islamic Republic's tentacles of terror aren't just confined to the borders of Iran. You've seen attempts at people's lives in the UK, in the United States, with journalists, including on this very channel, on Iran International. So I think people recognize the threats, but that's not to say that the people of Iran don't deserve a tremendous amount of international support that's sustained. Not necessarily action boots on the ground, not talking about that, but actual support, so that the people of Iran feel like they have the world's backing and they can take care of the rest when they choose to rise up.
And speaking of the people of Iran, and you mentioned that you have sources inside Iran who you interviewed for your novel, how did you choose who you included in Unveiled, and how did you cultivate these sources? Because really, at the end of the day, the most important people are not you and me, but the people inside of Iran.
Sure. It was a work in progress. Before my current role as Israel's international spokesperson to the UN, I was a journalist. Spent about 7 years writing about Iran, about Israel, about other issues related to foreign policy. And I started cultivating this network of trusted sources. It started from Iranian contacts who were in the diaspora, who then introduced me to either relatives or people that they knew inside the country. But of course, you have to be very careful of who you speak to, because some people are not who they say they are. But I mostly spoke to and gave voice to people who've already spoken publicly, who understand the risks they're taking in terms of speaking, and I concealed the identities of those who wanted to speak but didn't necessarily want the attribution.
Is there any story that really, or person rather, who stands out to you that you'd like to share with us?
There are so many extraordinary people. but just two come to mind, one inside Iran and one abroad. The person inside Iran was a mother of twins, young mother, Elahe Tavakolian, and she participated in one of the protests in Iran, and a peaceful protest, and she, amid the protest, she felt a very sharp thud, like in her head, and she was shot in the eye. She fell to the ground, and people around her were very scared to help her, because if you're seen aiding and abetting someone who's been suspected of taking part in a protest, you're sort of complicit according to the Islamic Republic. So her baby boys, young boys, thought she was dead and tried to revive her, and she eventually received emergency care abroad in Italy and then the United States, had to get her eye reconstructed, and now she's one of thousands of women who wear, that the eye patch of resistance, showing, and she's been speaking out at many different forums to highlight the fact that she's not going to be silenced, and she's been an unbelievable voice, a very inspirational voice. And the voice in the West, one of the extraordinary women was, you may know her, Giselle Sharmad, whose father was held on death row for almost 5 years and who was executed last October. He was a green card holder, a German citizen, Iranian citizen, and he was held. He was kidnapped while he was in Dubai on a connecting flight. An ally of the U.S. kidnapped, smuggled back to Iran, and then he was put through this kangaroo trial while he was going through, I believe, Parkinson's, and Giselle spent years and years and years trying to fight for his release, and clamoring, pressuring, asking different governments to help, and unfortunately it didn't yield to saving his life, and even now, after he was executed, his body still remains, it hasn't returned to her, so and his body, his organs were dismembered, and it was really a horrific ordeal, and she's been trying to retrieve his body, but she's been speaking out. She's been a really remarkable voice. She's spoken at the UN, Congress, all sorts of important areas, and she's a very, very brave voice that I was honored to speak to and highlight.
Yeah, she's really an incredible human being, a true fighting spirit, and she's not giving up at all. So one of the interesting things in Unveiled is you speak about the disconnect between the Islamic Republic and the people of Iran. 100%, I agree with that. I'm wondering, in your quest to write this novel, did you see any disconnect between various kind of classes inside Iran? And I bring that up because recently there's been some viral concerts in Tehran where we see people, women, appearing to wear what they want. They're hijabless, men and women mixing together. I almost, had to take a double take and go, oh my God, this is Tehran? And it was the concert of Sirvan Khosravi was taking place on the grounds of what was once the Shah's palace in Yerevan. But, I had Aras Sohrabi, who is the lead singer of Kiosk, a very popular band that was underground in Iran and came to the United States in 2005. And he brought up some good points that I didn't think about. He goes, well, Negar, there was no female performers on stage. How did people get access, to the venue? It was in a closed venue. It wasn't like it was at Shahryar Azadi Square where, a mass public could amass. It was controlled, and we talked about what could potentially be the price of tickets when there's, dry taps and water shortages, electricity shortages in Iran. A lot of poverty, obviously, and it felt like maybe only a certain class of people could get access to something like this or could afford something like this. Potentially people that are, I'm not saying they're the children of regime officials, but in some shape or form could be connected to that apparatus, because obviously Iran is controlled by its regime and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. You don't have private sector and independent entities there. So do you see a disconnect at all between certain classes within Iran, and how would that impact the future of Iran? Because if they appear to be dancing and smiling and enjoying their life, maybe they won't feel the need to rise up then. What do you think about that?
I think you certainly see different realities for people inside Iran depending on where you fall on the social ladder and depending on what your connection is with the Islamic Republic. And you do see some things that are contradictory, like many people who are dependent or benefiting from the Islamic Republic, from that IRGC infrastructure, making a lot of money, living a life of luxury, whereas the vast majority of Iranians inside Iran are not. So I think there may be a class issue there, but I think it more so it is to do with your connection to the Islamic Republic. But I also don't know if there was absolutely zero risk involved in people participating in this kind of concert. But I think we've seen this many times in Iran's recent history, where you have a sort of an appearance of concessions being made, a sort of appearance that perhaps the regime is moderating by giving these very small concessions, where in reality it's just sort of be like a PR stunt, but nothing is actually changing on the ground. So they may be allowing or facilitating this concert to take place, but clamping down on all other kinds of protests or music or women unveiling their hair. But I think even to this day, the morality police is still very much in force, and you do hear many instances of women who sing freely being incarcerated, arrested. So I think this is it's not as clear cut as it may seem.
Yeah, and that concert happened at the eve of Mahsa's anniversary, so the timing is significant, and that kind of hot, cold, push-pull tactic that you described.
It may have been also an attempt to detract from the anniversary itself, because as we saw on social media, and Iran International was hugely significant in this, that there were outbursts of protest taking place across Iran, and people haven't forgotten what happened to Mahsa Amini 3 years ago when she died on September 16th, 2022, and perhaps this concert was a sort of a way to distract some people in the world from what actually took place and from the Islamic Republic's brutality.
Yeah, and even that week alone, the execution of Babak Shahbazi, political dissident who was accused of being a spy for Israel, and the more than 1,000 people that have been executed, according to the Burman Human Rights Foundation, since this year alone.
Yeah, it's atrocious, and I'm appalled and very sad to see that the United Nations doesn't focus on this appalling human rights. And I was appalled to see that during Masoud Pezeshkian's speech yesterday, it was expected he didn't mention Iran's dire human rights record, so he didn't really mention Iran at all. He just spoke about the United States and Israel. But there wasn't much commentary around all of these omissions by Iran's president, and especially when it's so public and the world can see all of these executions, all of these instances of oppression and repression of the people of Iran, and it's really a disservice to the people of Iran.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your own personal journey. That's Jonathan Harounoff, the author of Unveiled. You can sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, you can head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.